Welcome to the Intentional Life podcast, where it's all about real strategies, real tools, and techniques to help you truly become the author of your life story.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Intentional Life podcast. Today, we're going to talk about something very exciting and that you might not have ever heard of, but that you'll find really useful in your life, which is the inner child. So the inner child is a concept in modern psychology that basically describes a part of our mind, let's just say. It's a part of us. And once we get familiar with this concept, it will become much easier to understand ourselves and why we sometimes behave in a certain way and sometimes in a very unreasonable way even. And also to understand others and their inner children better, right? So yeah, we're very excited to bring this episode to you because it might be brand new to you. So I think you'll get so much value out of it.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. First of all. Second of all, I definitely agree with this. And I think that even if you've heard this term being used before, we feel like, having this episode kind of dissecting a little bit, explaining that there are actually different types of inner children. Like, I think it's really useful even for those who are familiar with it, right? And maybe learning how to connect to it better. And we thought, could there be a more perfect time than releasing this episode now, just before Christmas? Because, Christmas is such a family celebration, but at the same time, we also like to spend some time as parents. Well, I'm not a parent, but say Camilla is. We do the extra, effort to really make this celebration like memorable for our kids. But then what about our inner children? Like, what about, us spending time and effort and connection on ourselves and reconnecting to the beautiful part of us? So we thought we have to do the inner child episode before Christmas because it's just beautiful.
Good timing. Yeah, it's good timing. And also, I don't know how you will celebrate Christmas or if you celebrate Christmas or something similar, but usually, we have a lot of family gatherings around that time. And sometimes, it doesn't go as smoothly as we hoped. And so knowing about the inner child that lives in all of us, in each and every one of us, will probably give you some tools to navigate difficult situations with your family and your friends during the holidays in a better way.
Yes, exactly. And apart from that, like if you asked us why it's so important to even do this work, and I think you can do the work on all kinds of different levels, the inner child work. But at the most deepest core of this work is really working with our traumatic experiences and healing them. Because even though a lot of these experiences were so small that when we experience them, we can't even recollect, we don't have conscious memories of it. However, what we do see is the reflection of those traumatic experiences in the form of our emotional reactions to people and situations day in and day out. And,
can I just say that traumatic, it doesn't need to be, like Vilma said, right? It doesn't need to be a huge thing that happened in your childhood, that maybe you were abused. What is traumatic to us as children is a whole lot of things, like not getting the toy that we want or, having someone take it away from us. Even that can be a little traumatic experience.
Exactly. Well, what is it called? The birth trauma, that already being, being born
oh my God.
is the first, original trauma, right? And also, I completely agree with you, Camilla. Sometimes what is very traumatic is, you'd get people or my clients sometimes say, well, I had, a healthy childhood, parents, so on and so forth. But often the trauma happens when we don't receive something like care and attention. Sometimes that's even more traumatic than us getting beaten for something. Right. So trauma can be, it's not really one dimensional. There are so many different colors and aspects of it. And when we see these reactions to certain people or situations, like I said, this is a very good sort of road sign and indication of what we're actually dealing with and what the original trauma could be. These reactions are often painful. We look at people and be like, well, that reaction was just so uncalled for. Like, why did they react to you in such a dramatic way, right? And then that's where you get called drama queen or drama king. And then there's
always easier to to detect in the others than in yourself.
It is. It's a mirror effect, isn't it? And then we'd be like, oh, that was just unreasonable. But what we have to understand is that when we have these reactions, what we do is just reenact the original trauma and our reaction to it. We don't want to experience it again. We do whatever we can to get away from it so we could feel better. And then this sets us up to spend our lives trying to escape from actually feeling the original pain and reliving it in order to heal it. Right. So again, that's what's really true in here with inner child work is that the only way out is always in. And this is our sort of, wish for you guys to shed a bit more light on the topic of inner child and hopefully inspire you to look for more information or more help to do this work. Right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So before we go ahead and get started on the different types of inner children, I firstly wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the inner family dynamic. While there is a lot of, again, I think this term inner child is not that new, it's been used for some time. However, what I found useful in the work of some researchers and psychologists like Susan Anderson, Richard Schwartz, what they did is that they identified two other aspects within ourselves who act as an inner family. So it's not just the inner child, but two other aspects who form in a way like a triad within us that actually really affects our reactions in daily lives. The main one is the inner child. And this is in a way we could see it as a baby inside of us, which is essentially us in our early developmental years, till say about 7 years of age. And when we tune into this energy, into this inner child energy, it usually tends to communicate like a child, right? It usually tends to use pretty simple language, and it usually is very concerned with wanting to have the most primal needs met: love, physical, emotional, nurturing, acceptance, attention, and safety. Emotional and physical safety and security is very important for a child. And another thing that you can identify with inner child when you see it being acted out in your daily life is when you tend to blame yourself for not getting your needs met. This is something that the inner child tends to do a lot, which is blaming themselves if something went wrong. And I think this is a huge one because I've seen it play out so much in certain types of people. For instance, codependent people in relationships, they often tend to blame themselves for things going wrong or their needs not being met. And this comes from really, really early childhood trauma. For instance, maybe the parents were narcissistic and they would used to blame them for everything, and the child just takes on that sort of pattern to their adult relationships as well. And so the inner child tends to harbor this trauma or dysfunctional relationships from the formative years, and they're not able to rationalize it and live it out. So whenever we find ourselves feeling inadequate, unworthy, unlovable, unsafe, it's that core baby inner child within us feeling abandoned and anxious and nervous and sometimes even depressed. Sometimes depression can also be linked to the really traumatic core experiences in the formative years. So that's the first one. Can you identify with this part, Camilla?
Yes, absolutely. It's a really helpful framework because, as you said, we need to always ask ourselves, are we now in the inner child? Are we in the inner parent? So I love this.
Yeah. So another aspect of it, the second part, is again what's not often talked about, but I love this concept, is what could be called as inner teenager. It's the part of us which is protective, it's representing the ego, and sometimes it even shows up as a self-saboteur. Again, a topic that, a lot of the people in this community talk about. And what it does, it represents us in our teenage years. So what it often does is it shows the behavior patterns of being rebellious, misguiding, acting out of the feelings, of pain and frustration, and they do so in various sort of counterproductive, destructive ways. And I would say the typical behavior would be being impulsive, seeking for quick fixes, wanting instant gratification here and now, even if it's at the expense of the health, relationship, job, even integrity. And inner teenager can, like really likes to project, blame others, sabotage, and also they are very, I would say, short-term focused. They're unable to think about, to plan for the future, right? Because all they care, like I said, is about giving that instant feedback and pleasure, so they wouldn't have to feel the pain. And what's interesting as well, that in a teenager can also be recognized, or the patterns of the inner teenager can be recognized in people who are perfectionists and who are arrogant or competitive, maybe because that's their way of masking a sense of inadequacy and unworthiness. And that's all in a teenager. And the final part in our family dynamic, or of this triad, as I like to call it, is the adult self, which actually represents the conscious higher self. And it acts almost like the bridge between the two parts, the inner child and the inner teenager. Because what it can do is it can nurture the inner child, because nurturing is the main need of the inner child. And it can also parent the teenager by keeping it in line. And this energy also, you can feel this adult self energy in us when we sort of do maybe spiritual practices, when we take on sort of self-development activities, because the voice of adult self is, and the energy of it is sort of very loving, it's calm, it's accepting, it's non-judgmental, it's just curious. It notices the behavioral patterns and it does not attach the meaning to it. It has a lot of compassion for both of those parts, and it's sort of the spiritual core and the center of us. However, if we don't take time to consciously cultivate this adult self, this energy, and I'm sure in different, maybe religions or different theories, this adult self probably is named differently. This is just one of the concepts that I'm offering to you. But if we don't take time to really strengthen it, what happens is that the other two parts essentially are left parentless, right? And then our inner teenager takes on the parenting role for the inner child. And that's what when that happens, you find that people get really rigid, really defensive. Their inner teenager is trying to protect the baby from continuing the traumatic experiences, that same cycle. So really what it does is that people start acting out a lot, even as adults. Like, again, going back to the full circle where our reactions become really inadequate, right? Sometimes aggressive even. So this is sort of, really, really beautiful cycle and really beautiful triad of the three different parts in us that I wanted to introduce to you guys.
I love that. It's such a great, as I said, it's such a great framework and really helpful. And I think everyone, even those that have never heard of this concept before, will be able to immediately be able to kind of pinpoint, okay, that's typically when I'm in the inner child. That's when I'm in my inner teenager. And that's when I'm in my adult self.
Well, the goal is to be in our adult self as much as possible. But then again, if we only stay in the adult self, then we won't be able to heal and play out the aspects that need to be healed, right? So we have to also be realistic that it's okay to be in the inner child. It's okay to act out sometimes, as long as we're conscious of it, right?
Exactly. And the inner child and the inner teenager, they are a part of all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are a part of all of us. And so we should not, push them away or resist them, even once that we've become aware that they exist and in what ways they sometimes sabotage ourselves, right? So it's really important to kind of embrace them and then still step into your adult self as often and as much as you can. And you will, the first step I always say is just becoming aware.
Yeah.
And once you do that, and once you're able to do that, the rest will kind of, I think the rest will kind of follow. Because you can never go back to not knowing something that you know. That's the beauty of it.
You cannot unknow it. Exactly.
Exactly. That's when everything related to inner work and everything that we're bringing to you. The great thing is that once you know certain things, you just know. You can't go back to not knowing. Like I said. So coming back to the inner child. A way that I like to imagine this, and it's a little bit similar to the limiting beliefs. If you remember a couple of episodes ago, we talked about limiting beliefs, how they are formed. So something happens in our life that can't be fully understood and processed, right? So the sensitivity to feel it is there, and it could be something pleasant or unpleasant, but not the, let's say, cognitive capabilities to make full sense of it. So when we look at really, really small infants, right, the experiences that come in to them, they kind of move through in a way. So a baby could be crying its lungs out, and then the next minute, it's fed or whatever it needed, and now it's fine again, and that's just that. And even a toddler could be, throwing a tantrum, and then 5 minutes later, they can be laughing again, and they seemingly have forgotten all about it. So I think the smaller we are, the more capable we are of letting things just kind of happen and pass. But then we quickly develop this higher sensitivity, right? And that's when things that happen to us and that come into our minds get stuck there. And yeah, so limiting beliefs are formed, as well as our inner child that's formed more and more and more in those childhood years, right? So be it 0 to 7 or more or less, give and take. And the first books that I read on the inner child were by the psychologist Hugh Missildine. And his work that's like a funny little anecdote. He actually goes as far as to say that when you're in a relationship, it's actually 4 people in there. It's the two people and the 2 inner children as well. And now with Vilma's framework, you might say, there's a whole bunch of people in there.
The football team in the relationship, not just 2 of you.
So the inner children, they might fight for attention, appreciation. They want their needs to be met right here and right now. They have their own set of rules. That could be, the inner teenager that has those rules, and it has to be like this and it cannot be like that. And so that makes all kinds of relationships that much more complicated. So oftentimes also our inner children mirror the way that our parents treated us, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that is what we bring into other relationships often, because essentially the dynamic that we had with our parents, that feels like home to us. So even if it wasn't a good dynamic or a healthy dynamic, it still sometimes feels like home, and subconsciously we might look to recreate it in our adult life and in our adult relationships, right? And that's when people say, oh, I keep attracting this kind of person. Well, it might be that you're actually subconsciously looking for this kind of person and this kind of dynamic.
Yeah. And it also goes back to the brain, right? Because the brain will always be seeking for something that's familiar, because that represents safety, even though it's not actually safe when you look at it, but it assumes it is a safe situation because it has happened before, right? So it will draw the people and experiences to allow us to recreate that feeling of safety, even though it's not serving us anymore. And this is where awareness comes in.
Exactly. And especially because the actual child wasn't able to make sense of certain things. So they might have felt, oh, well, I don't like this is unpleasant, but still they couldn't make enough sense of it and didn't have the tools to say, well, this is actually wrong in the relationship with my parents. So they just kind of accepted the way it is, and it still lingers in them and in their inner children when they get older. So while every inner child is unique, and it manifests in many different ways, and it will have very different facets, just like you do, just like any child would, right? So your inner child is absolutely unique and different from anyone else's. However, there are some typical inner children according to the way we were raised. And if you're just starting with inner child work, this might be a very useful framework to start identifying, where you are, what your inner child is like. Again, this is based on the studies by Hugh Missildine. So let me present some of the typical parent types that call forth typical children and thus inner children that live inside of you in your adult life. So the first are very perfectionist parents. So they are often, very successful and driven parents that want their kids to excel, to aspire for more. They have very high standards and very high expectations in their children. And so the inner child that is formed here in your childhood will often long for a lot of attention and for appraisal, even in adult life, because that's usually what they fell short of. And also, of course, they will strive for perfection because that's the standard, quote unquote, because there are people that say perfection isn't a standard because it's actually unattainable. But to them, it will be the standard of all of their, endeavors and strivings and interactions. So this can lead to them becoming very harsh and critical with themselves and with others as well, very not very forgiving. And essentially, they could start forming this dynamic of, on the one hand, having very high expectations in themselves, trying really hard, giving their best, but then usually falling short because, as we said, right, perfection cannot be attained, and then shaming themselves because they're not good enough. And that's why they need so much feedback from the outside world to tell them that they are good enough and that they've done a good job.
Yeah, that's a good one. And then probably one of the core needs is significance, right? Because when we had the human needs, probably that comes out as well. Also very interesting with these type of people, with that sort of type of inner child, what happens, because I've done this exercise with some of my clients, is that inner criticism, that inner critic usually takes the words and even intonations of one of the parents.
Yeah.
So they will find themselves telling themselves the exact same thing that the mother or the father used to tell them when they were criticizing them. And it's really taunting because this endless loop of this criticism, no matter whether they even do well sometimes, but people say, oh, you did really great. And then they'll be like, no, it wasn't good enough, right? Because that's what the father used to tell them. So again, being a bit more conscious, and maybe sometimes I even ask my clients to actually write down the exact words and keep the diary with them and just write those thoughts down. And when they actually see and read themselves what the inside inner critic says, they get goosebumps. They go like, this is exactly what my mother or my father used to tell me. So again, noticing that is really, really important and could be very healing.
Yeah. And how you bring this dynamic into your adult life without even noticing, subconsciously. So right. So that was the first parent, is the perfectionist parent type. The second one is the parents that are overly critical with their kids, right? So it's those typical parents that always said, do this. No, don't do it that way. Do it differently. Come here right now. You have to do this. You have to do that. So they're constantly behind their kids, kind of like nagging them and being critical and telling them basically, chewing them, how to do things and when to do them and so forth. So a lot of times those children and the inner children that are formed in the formative years become very passive, because it's kind of like this passive resistance to guard their individuality. So as an adult with this type of inner child, people sometimes have a hard time motivating themselves. They procrastinate. They usually still, again, like Vilma just mentioned, right? They usually give themselves orders in their mind that their parents would have given them. So you have to do this. You have to go on a diet now. You have to, these kind of orders, but then can't really get around to doing them because of their reaction, their averse reaction to orders that, they've known from their childhood. And so without even having done anything, they still feel exhausted, because it's this constant inner tension and inner dialogue between giving yourself an order, but then kind of being like, oh no, I can't do it. And it's, I don't want to do it. There's a level of you that doesn't want to do it. And interestingly, again, when it comes to relationships, if it's not yourself given these orders, you might be looking and picking a partner that will do that for you, right? So a partner that's constantly, kind of controlling and telling you how to do things and what not to do and what to cook today and what to
Where? What
whatever
to
it is,
wear? Yeah,
what to
what should
wear.
be the color of your hair? It's really interesting because actually, if I may add an example from real life, I was at my hairdresser's, I don't know, a few months back, and we were talking about hair. I'm always really interested, like speaking to people in different industries because it's just fascinating to me, right? Especially if they're
Mhm.
passionate about the work.
Oh,
And we were
yes.
talking about what was it? I think blonde hair, and then I was telling her, I've always had more fun as a blonde because I had all kinds of colors of hair.
Mhm.
There's something about it. It's just so lighter, you're like almost entitled to have more fun or not be so serious. And then we were talking about relationships, and she said, oh, you would be surprised how many women come in here and they tell me that they need to stay blonde or brunette because the boyfriends find that more attractive, and their boyfriends
Really?
are not allowing them to change their haircut or making them grow their hair out so it would be long because they find it beautiful, and they
Mm,
don't question that, right? And
that's
then
so crazy.
that's
And women
crazy.
are so prone to falling for this kind of behavior where they'll just, comply with some actually completely ridiculous
Requests, yeah.
requests. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And, and then apparently, she told me a couple of really horrible examples where, like, Jesus, where basically a man told to his wife that, like, if you ever change or cut your hair, I'm going to divorce you. And I said, you're joking. She said, no, I hear that, like, every now and then I have these women who come in and they get so terrified. She goes, like, once I cut more hair, like, I had to cut the ends and I cut more because they were just not looking nice. She ended up hysterically crying, telling me that she's going to be kicked out of the flat. And
Oh my
and I
God.
said, wow, that's, of course this is an extreme example, right? But I'm just saying that just goes to show to what Camilla said, that it does happen. What we end up doing is playing out the family dynamic that we had growing up, and we look for the same in our partners because it's familiar. And in this
Yeah.
situation, one of the solutions would be to look at the ecology of our goals. I'm not sure if that's a term. It just came to me, so I might have read it or just came up with it. But basically, really asking yourself and crystallizing why you want what you want. Is it truly you and your authenticity asking you to take action? Or is it, again, your parent, your partner, your friend expecting you, pushing you towards something?
Or could it be that you don't want to do something as an act of rebellion? Because that also happens to this inner child, that it actually rebels against the orders, right? So you might not be doing something that's actually good for you just because you want to show them, well, just because you say so, I won't do it. So that could
Yes.
also be the
Yeah,
case.
yes, like the inner teenager. And actually, I was thinking about exactly this thing when you were talking about perfectionist parents. And I was thinking, well, sometimes when you have perfectionist parents, in order to get the attention, you want to act out and do the exact opposite because that's
Yeah.
also the attention, right? Also
Yeah.
connection. Yeah.
Yes. Totally. Could also happen. So right. So let's move on to another type of parent, which is the careless parent. So it's not necessarily a parent that doesn't love and nurtures his child. It's just well, it could be, but it could also be, typically this happens when if it's an only child or the parents are divorced and they kind of want to compensate something, and then they end up being too permissive with their children, or they end up even becoming a servant of their children because they don't want to alterate them in any way. They want them to be happy, and it's like, okay, yes, watch another hour of whatever, and okay, you can go out for longer, and they will just be more permissive, right? So permissive parents, um, they often bring forth children and inner children as a consequence, that are very demanding and impulsive, that throw tantrums to basically get what they want because they're used to getting away with that. They usually have little grit and resistance. So when
Mm,
something gets hard, they just throw in the towel because why bother?
yeah.
Maybe there's an easier way of getting it.
Mm-hmm.
They also often use anger and as and manipulation as a weapon. So, for instance, if you don't do this, if you don't give me this, then it means that you don't love me.
Mm,
That probably worked with their parents that were so eager to even please them, but obviously in adult life, this will call for many conflicts and tensions within yourself and also within your interactions with other people or in your relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then the fourth type is kind of the opposite of the careless, permissive parent, which is the overly spoiled child, right? So typical parents that usually or that oftentimes spoil their children are either wealthy parents that have the means to spoil them, and they don't want them to go without. They want them to have the best of everything, right, and all the opportunities in the world. But also it could be parents who as children were underprivileged. So they want to make sure that their children now get what they didn't have as children growing up, right? So they kind of overcompensate and they act the same way. And also parents that feel guilty for whatever reason, right? So they want to give to the child, they want to make life easy for them. In an extreme way. And what happens with those children and the inner children that come forth in those children is that they're often kind of chronically bored, whiny, they lack interest, real interest in things. So the difference to the permissively raised children is that those are very demanding, and the spoiled child is passive. And it's chronically unsatisfied. It often expects others to help them, to cater to them, to fix things for them, to even kind of be able to read what their desires are. So they have a lot of expectations in others, but at the same time, they're sort of restless within. They're not happy. They're unfulfilled. They know that they could be more independent and they could strive for so much more, but then somehow they can't act on it. So also very typical for them to drop out of something when it gets too hard. It could be, university, or it could be even therapy.
Relationships. Yeah,
exactly. Your job, your relationship, even therapy or coaching, right? When they notice that they need to put a lot of hard work in, they probably like, oh no, let me get out of here.
Yes. Yeah, because they never had to put in that grit and build sort of the muscle of hard work and achieving and planning for something, right? Because everything was delivered on a silver platter. And also part of this that I recognize as well is that a lot of these parents who overcompensate, especially when it comes to gifts and a financial abundance, very often, especially if they come from under sort of privileged backgrounds, they often think that the financial gifts are really making sure that the child has everything is enough in and of itself, because that was something that they were lacking themselves when they're growing up. So they just focus on that. And unfortunately, that sometimes means that they don't have enough time to actually give love and attention to the child, right?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes and sometimes love and attention comes in the form of boundaries and of being a little harsher and saying, no, you cannot do that. Actually, that's what we notice now with children that were raised very permissively or very spoiled, is that they actually on some level interpreted it as a lack of love and attention, because sometimes it's the boundary that shows the kid, I really care for you, so I cannot let you do that, right? And so then just quickly to introduce one more typical inner child, that is the one formed when you grew up with hypochondriacal parents. Is that the word, actually?
Well, hypochondria. Well, the guys do not native speakers trying to pronounce the word. Yeah. I think people know what we mean.
Yeah, I think hypochondria, right? So when parents that always anticipated that you could fall sick, every symptom, like, oh my God, so they really overprotected you, and they kind of, the typical parent that says, oh, don't run too quick, you could fall. Don't go up there, you could fall. Yeah. This could happen. You could catch a cold. Oh my God, and they're so exaggerated in their way of wanting to protect the child from any harm, that these children grow up not believing in themselves at all and in their own capabilities and even in their own ability to decide, what they can do, what's good for them. So these are children that usually give up before they even started, because they literally don't believe in themselves, and they're very scared to put themselves out there and to maybe want something. And then what happens is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that when you always anticipate that you could fall ill or that you could hurt yourself, it often happens also. So that's actually a dynamic. There is something behind it. It's not just a coincidence that you might attract more, diseases and so forth.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love to know if you if these inner children resemble the way that you grew up, the way that your parents raised you, and the way that you notice that you or your inner child, now that you know that it's actually this part of you called the inner child, is acting. And yeah, and you might even notice that you are a mix of two, or even a mix of three, right? This often happens. So yes, hopefully this gave you a good way to kind of dive into which type of inner child you are, and also how you can raise your children, or how you should maybe not raise your children, in order to avoid them growing up with a lot of baggage in form of their inner child.
Yeah, I guess it's just, not being in excess of any of these types. I think, that would help. And also I feel like, when we were just listening to you talk, and we mentioned, different types of inner children, we mentioned different parts within us, and it all is just basically showing just how fragmented we are, and the goal of all of us, of all of our beings, of our soul, is to integrate and attune and move towards wholeness. And I think, that's why we wanted to talk about inner children and the work that you could do with inner children, because that would essentially be moving towards your whole being, and not having those different types of you act out all the time, because their needs would be met and they would feel served. Therefore, you will not even notice them that much anymore. They will be reintegrated, right? They're still there, but they're healthier, they're happier, like I said, with their needs being met. And there are all kinds of different, work that you can do. Very briefly, I want to mention my favorite one, which is by Teal Swan, and it's called The Completion Process. She has a whole book about it, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm going to link everything down below. But basically what she suggests is exactly that, the process of completing and reintegrating those parts of yourself, specifically your inner child. And it's a very sort of clear and strategic and holistic approach. And it takes you step by step how to beautifully reintegrate, by firstly creating a safe haven for yourself, which would act as a primary safe sort of support figure. Then you go into emotional vipassana, which is learning how to stay sort of unconditionally present with all of the strong feelings and reactions that we had learned to avoid. And then really, after you acknowledge and stay in it, validating it. And then maybe, if you can, inviting the memory of the original trauma to surface. Sometimes we don't even remember, but just sort of feeling those feelings and re-experiencing it and validating that experience is healing in and of itself. And then what you can do, which I found really, really powerful, is actually consciously stepping into the memory from an adult perspective. Because like we said, and Camilla mentioned, as children, we don't have the ability to process what is happening to us. We just take everything for granted. However, if you take that memory and step into from sort of an adult's perspective, you can then be a grown-up who's validating your inner child's emotions. And as an adult, you can sort of help them deal and explain the situation and meet the needs within the memory. And then sort of that's how you close the loop, and whatever the original trauma happened, you sort of heal it, change it, and you will see the effects of it in your daily life and how your reactions change. So really, it's the work that needs to be performed for you to see the benefits, right? Again, just I guess maybe just like with everything that we talk about on this podcast, there's one thing listening to us and saying like, oh, that resonates, and a whole different level of actually going through the process and then seeing the result in your daily life, which will act as a motivator for you to continue doing the work.
Yes. Absolutely. And again, just to reiterate what Vilma already said, the importance of realizing that this is a part of you. It's not a bad part of you. It's just a natural part of you. And to um, basically nurture this inner child, that is what it needs. It kind of needs to heal, but not by rejecting it, but to kind of by embracing it and by letting it be part of this family, while knowing that you should always step into your adult self when possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are your other favorite ways of connecting to your inner child?
Basically, what I learned is to speak to it in the way that you would speak to a child, right? So when you notice, instead of getting really frustrated about your inner child acting out, once you've analyzed, how it does it, to basically treat it as if it were an actual child. So how would you speak to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say, so let me give you an example. Let's say that you tend to overeat because that's what gives you comfort, and you detect that this is your inner child, wanting to kind of distract itself from something and just or wanting that quick gratification in form of food or whatever it is, right? So let's say that's your inner child acting out. So instead of saying, oh, you have to go on a diet now, you cannot ever eat sugar again. So maybe try a different approach. Try the approach of saying, okay, ask yourself, what would you say to a child? Would you say you can never have a cookie again if that's what it's craving? Or would you say, okay, so you can have a cookie once after you had your healthy lunch, and then when you, I don't know, when maybe as a little treat or something, tomorrow again or next week again. Wouldn't you rather try this kind of approach? So we're no different. Our inner children are no different. They need this kind of, they need this parenting by the adult self.
Mm. Yeah, actually, I came up with this, but I think again, I read it. It just happens to me when you read so many things, it just becomes a concept in your head and you're not
Yeah.
sure if that's yours or not, or maybe it's yours with a twist. But I was thinking of self-parenting model as well when I was not feeling well the other week. And then I was just randomly, it came to me, it's like, well, what would a loving parent now do to me? And then I thought, well, I'm not feeling well and I'm not feeling like, doing anything at home. And then I was thinking, well, if a parent would now really take some time to cook a really nice, heartwarming like meal, right, with a lot of veggies and sort of holistic and all sort of forth. And I actually ended up doing that for myself. And then
Yeah.
I found myself asking this question in these situations where where your natural go-to status quo reaction would be like to lay down or like procrastinate or Netflix or whatever, right? I'd be like, what would a parent do? Well, the parent would, make you take you a bath or whatever it is that is like healing and soothing. And I find it really like it's working and sort of introducing so much more compassion to myself when I'm not
Absolutely.
feeling
I
well.
do that too. To kind of parent myself through maybe a difficult time and do something that's good for me.
Yeah.
But rather, as you said, in the form of a good meal or something, than in the form of watching, 10 episodes of something on Netflix. So and
Yeah,
hopefully this is what
exactly.
your parent would also have done.
Yeah, exactly. It's a sort of ideal version of your parents. Not to say that your parents are not great, right? It's just sort of it's just something that is a great tool that I find really works. Also, I love connecting to inner children, and I suggest it to everyone is through creativity. Just really facilitating your creative process, whatever it would be. Because look at children; they could spend most of their day either building something, drawing something, running around, moving in the way that they want to move. Right, Camilla? You're a big testament to that. And it really is all to do with them just unconditionally expressing themselves, and that is creativity in itself. A lot of the times we start putting limits on ourselves, thinking what would make sense, what would not make sense, but really surrendering to that inner need to just express yourself, even if it like looks a little silly. I find it so liberating and so, I don't know, like it just feeds my soul sometimes,
Yeah, you can also learn a lot from your inner child.
Yeah. Totally. So
Mm.
doing something creating, just really introducing creative practices into your life, whatever is calling you right now, being dancing or drawing or I don't know, whatever it could be, singing, right? Camilla,
You
by
know
the
what I
way,
started
you
doing?
told us you're gonna release your album for
Oh
Christmas.
yeah, I totally have it planned for Christmas. I
Okay,
really
cool.
do. I have it back home. I don't have it here in Spain with me. So, but I'll do that. And you know what I started doing just now that you're saying that? I
Mm.
started to kind of, is it called skipping? You know, when you kind of
Yeah.
you don't run, you skip, right? And I do that with my kids. Is it called that, right?
Yeah,
When you
it's
kind of go
skipping. Yeah.
from one leg to the other. And I
Yeah.
do with my kids. We have like this special song that we sing, and oh my god, it's so much fun. It puts us
Right.
all in such a good mood.
Yeah.
So
That's
yeah,
great. Do you do it in public or do you do it in public or
no, at home.
I would totally do
We
it.
run along the corridor. We skip along the corridor.
So much fun.
Yeah, so guys, we really hope that you enjoyed this episode and that we shed a lot of light on to your inner child and maybe the inner child of the closest people around you that you're obviously also observing and having to deal with sometimes. And yeah, definitely let us know what came up for you. If you identified with a specific inner child, if you noticed yourself going more into your inner child or more into your inner teenager, if you know what helps you to step into your adult self, just observe that over the next 2 weeks and definitely let us know in the comments.
Yeah, probably more than 2 weeks because I think this is going to be the last episode of the year, isn't it?
Oh yeah, so it might be 3 weeks, right?
Yeah, well, 4. I don't
Or
know.
4. So next
We haven't
time we'll be back, you'll hear about it. We'll
Yes,
announce
in
it as always.
2020, yeah, we're gonna ask you
Yay.
about us. So yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate your feedback and your love, and we enjoy doing this so much. It is really fun. If you have any requests or suggestions for the topics for the next year, please let us know. We'll gladly do it. We usually take up topics that actually resonate with Camilla and I in the moment, so we really try to be just responsive and respect the processes that we're going through ourselves. And I think that makes for the content that really, you can feel that we're extremely passionate about whatever we're talking of.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you so much for staying with us, for the new subscribers. And it was a beautiful journey for Camilla and I starting this podcast. And yeah, many years to come.
Absolutely. Almost 1 year, right?
I don't know. When did we start? I don't even recall
Was
now.
it about April or something like that? We'll let you know. We'll let you know.
Yeah.
Do an
Yeah.
anniversary episode, definitely.
Exactly. Yes, guys. And as we have promised some episodes ago, we're still looking for one lucky winner because we want to gift someone who subscribes and leaves the comments on iTunes. And we want to gift them a personalized 2020 calendar. So you could plan your dream life. And I'm so excited. Oh my God. Can't
Exciting.
wait.
So please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. And yes, you might be the lucky winner.
Thanks so much for tuning in again. And happy Christmas. Happy holidays, you guys.
Happy holidays to everyone. Speak to you soon. Bye. Thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe, share, and comment, and do let us know how our tips are working out for you. You can find our websites below, and we'd love to virtually meet you there.